Nearly 2 years have passed since the night 4 University of Idaho students were brutally murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow. The man accused, Bryan Kohberger, has been at the center of one of the most closely watched trials in the nation. But across 2025, new rulings, newly released videos, and courtroom decisions have reshaped this case. In this documentary, we will walk through the verified developments month by month, what happened in court, what evidence was revealed, and how the story has changed since the murders of November 2022. If you haven't already, subscribe and stay tuned, because this channel is dedicated to bringing you accurate, verified updates on true crime cases as they unfold. In February 2025, the Bryan Kohberger case reached a turning point. After months of legal back and forth, Judge Stephen Hippler made a series of rulings that would shape how the trial would proceed. On February 20th, 2025, the defense filed multiple motions attempting to suppress critical pieces of evidence. Among them were challenges to the use of investigative genetic genealogy DNA, the cell phone tower data that allegedly tracked Kohberger's movements on the night of the murders, and other forensic records. The defense argued that the methods used were invasive, unconstitutional, and lacked transparency. But Judge Hippler rejected these arguments. In a detailed ruling, he explained that the investigative genetic genealogy process, where law enforcement uploaded crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases to find familial matches, was legally permissible. This decision was significant because many legal experts had speculated the court might limit or exclude IGG, given the privacy concerns surrounding consumer DNA databases. Instead, the judge affirmed that prosecutors could present this evidence, strengthening their case against Kohberger. The ruling also applied to cell tower data, which had been a point of contention since early 2023. According to prosecutors, the records placed Kohberger's phone near the victim's off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho, on multiple occasions, both before and on the night of the murders. The defense argued the collection of this data was overly broad and violated his Fourth Amendment rights. But again, Judge Hippler disagreed. He noted that law enforcement obtained the data with proper warrants and that it was admissible in court. These rulings ensured that the prosecution retained its strongest evidence: the genealogical DNA link, the cell phone location records, and forensic samples. Without them, the state's case could have been significantly weakened. Legal analysts immediately weighed in. Some described the rulings as a catastrophic blow to the defense, who had hoped to dismantle the foundation of the prosecution's arguments before trial. Others noted that the case would now hinge on whether jurors would find the DNA and cell phone records persuasive enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For the victims' families, the February 2025 rulings represented a step toward closure. Many had expressed frustration over the long delays caused by legal wrangling. Now, with the judge's decisions, the path to trial or plea negotiations became clearer. From a broader perspective, this ruling also had national implications. Investigative genetic genealogy is still a relatively new tool in American courts, and each ruling sets a precedent for future cases. By allowing it in the Kohberger trial, Judge Hippler signaled that IGG is gaining wider acceptance in the legal system, despite ongoing debates about privacy and ethics. Ultimately, February 2025 solidified the prosecution's advantage. With evidence intact, Kohberger's defense team faced mounting pressure. They could either fight a steep uphill battle in trial or consider negotiating a plea deal, something that would become clearer in the months that followed. Among all the pieces of evidence in the Bryan Kohberger case, none has drawn more attention than the knife sheath discovered at the crime scene. Found next to the body of Madison Mogen, the sheath contained DNA that investigators later matched to Kohberger through investigative genetic genealogy. In February 2025, this evidence took center stage again when the defense filed a motion to suppress the DNA. They argued that investigators mishandled the sheath, that the testing methods were unreliable, and that the initial DNA comparison was not conducted with proper oversight. Their central claim was that the FBI's genetic genealogy work was a violation of Kohberger's constitutional rights because the government had searched through consumer DNA databases without his knowledge or consent. prosecution countered strongly. They maintained that the sheath had been preserved, handled, and tested correctly. More importantly, they argued that the DNA on the sheath had been confirmed through multiple layers of analysis. After the genealogical research pointed to the Kohberger family, investigators obtained a sample of his father's DNA from discarded trash in Pennsylvania. That test revealed a familial match, narrowing in on Bryan Kohberger. Later, when Kohberger was arrested, his direct DNA swab allegedly matched the sample taken from the sheath. Judge Stephen Hippler, in a ruling filed in late February 2025, sided with the prosecution. He wrote that the methods used to identify Kohberger were lawful, targeted, and supported by valid warrants. This meant that the sheath DNA, the piece of evidence many experts call the linchpin of the case, remains admissible at trial. This was a devastating setback for the defense. Without excluding the sheath, their strategy of undermining the state's forensic evidence was severely weakened. Legal experts noted that while cross-examination might still raise doubts about contamination or chain of custody, the jury would almost certainly hear about the DNA link tying Kohberger to the crime scene. For the families of the victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the ruling was another sign that the case was moving forward, even after months of delay. Many had voiced frustration at the lengthy pretrial hearings, but the February 2025 decision gave them renewed confidence that the strongest evidence would not be dismissed. Beyond the courtroom, this development also reignited debates across the United States about privacy and forensic science. Critics of genetic genealogy worry that allowing law enforcement to search consumer DNA databases opens the door to government overreach. Supporters argue the opposite, that if tools like this can solve brutal crimes, they should absolutely be used. The Kohberger case, because of its high profile, has become one of the most closely watched examples of how genealogy and DNA science collide with constitutional rights. As of February 2025, the sheath DNA remains firmly in the prosecution's arsenal. For Bryan Kohberger and his defense team, this means facing trial with one of the most incriminating pieces of physical evidence still intact. In the days and weeks following the murders of November 13, 2022, investigators pieced together a timeline using surveillance cameras and vehicle tracking. As of 2025, some of those videos have been released publicly, though many route details remain unknown or unverified in open records. One of the most compelling new videos shows Bryan Kohberger walking through stores a few hours after the murders, carrying himself with an unsettling calm. Some reputable news outlets published footage that captures him attempting to enter a Costco in Clarkston, Washington, but being denied entry for not having a membership. He keeps his left hand tucked in his pocket, possibly concealing injury, before later appearing in a nearby grocery store. That video is significant not just because of what it depicts, but because it refines how investigators map Kohberger's post-crime movements. It confirms that within hours of the attack, he was traveling in public and making stops, behavior which prosecutors will argue is consistent with someone trying to return to normalcy or hide tracks. But the path between the crime scene and these stores remains murky in public records. No fully confirmed surveillance loop shows his car circling the King Road area from multiple vantage points, at least not in publicly released, reliably sourced materials. Where we do have verification is on the admissibility of DNA and investigative genealogy evidence, which helps anchor the vehicle claims in a firmer evidentiary foundation. In February 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler declined to throw out that genetic evidence, rejecting the defense's motion to suppress it as unconstitutional. That decision allowed investigators to tie the knife sheath DNA to Kohberger using Investigative Genetic Genealogy, IGG, a technique that had been challenged but ultimately upheld in his case. As that genetic link holds, surveillance footage like the Costco video becomes more than just incidental. It operates as complementary evidence, aligning his public movements with forensic ties to the crime scene. The video shows someone behaving as though nothing catastrophic had occurred hours earlier, but prosecutors assert that those behaviors raise deeper questions about composure, guilt, and timing. Still, some defense arguments remain. Because not all cameras are documented in public records, and since published videos rarely show interior angles or private roads, there are unavoidable gaps. The defense contends that footage of a car or person does not inherently place the suspect at the scene. There must be linkage via plate, timestamp synchronization, or corroborating evidence. For the victims' families, the surveillance video release was a bitter confirmation. Yes, Kohberger was seen in public soon after the murders. That, combined with DNA and the ruling allowing it, constrains how far the defense can credibly argue plausible alternative paths. In the next chapter, we will study the DNA and genetic genealogy evidence in depth, how investigators built the bridge from knife sheath to suspect, and how those methods survived legal challenges. Alongside DNA, one of the most important categories of evidence in the Bryan Kohberger case is cell phone data. Investigators say Kohberger's phone was tracked traveling near the victim's off-campus home in the weeks leading up to the murders, and crucially, on the night itself. Court records show that his phone pinged cell towers near the King Road residence at least 12 times prior to November 13, 2022. Prosecutors argue this demonstrates a pattern, surveillance, or what they call pre-offense conduct. The most debated detail is what happened during the early morning hours of the killings. According to the probable cause affidavit, Kohberger's phone was switched off between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m., almost exactly the time frame of the murders. When it reconnected, it pinged again south of Moscow, Idaho, as though he had deliberately turned it off to avoid detection. The defense has fought to suppress or discredit this evidence. They argue that cell tower triangulation is not precise enough to put a person at a specific location, only within a general area. They also claim that Kohberger often drove late at night and that these pings could reflect normal driving patterns, not surveillance or planning. In February 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler sided with the prosecution, ruling that the cell tower data was lawfully obtained with warrants and could be admitted at trial. This was another serious setback for the defense, which had hoped to weaken the digital case against their client. Experts point out that while cell phone records alone may not prove guilt, they become far more powerful when combined with other evidence. In Kohberger's case, prosecutors can overlay the cell tower data with surveillance footage of his car and with the DNA recovered from the knife sheath. Taken together, the evidence paints a picture not of coincidence, but of deliberate presence and planning. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the cell phone records are chilling. They suggest that the man accused of murdering their children may have been watching the house for weeks. Each new filing from prosecutors reinforces the idea that this was not a random act, but a calculated attack. As of early 2025, the cell phone evidence remains intact, admissible, and central to the case. The defense faces the uphill task of convincing jurors that the records are unreliable or coincidental, a strategy that many legal analysts believe will be difficult to sustain in the face of corroborating evidence. While the prosecution built a case around DNA, cell phone data, and forensic evidence, Bryan Kohberger's defense team worked to challenge the admissibility and reliability of that evidence. Their strategy, as reported in February 2025 court filings, focused on several key points. First, the defense questioned investigative genetic genealogy. They argued that the method used to identify Kohberger through familial DNA searches violated constitutional protections. They claimed the use of consumer DNA databases without direct consent overstepped privacy boundaries. Prosecutors countered that the method was legal, supported by warrant approvals, and conducted under strict guidelines. Ultimately, Judge Stephen Hippler rejected these motions, allowing the evidence to remain in the case. Second, the defense contested cell phone tower data, claiming that triangulation is inherently imprecise. They argued that while the phone may have been in the vicinity, it does not prove Kohberger was at the crime scene at the time of the murders. The judge, however, ruled the evidence admissible, noting that it was legally obtained and relevant in combination with other forensic findings. Third, the defense challenged procedural aspects of evidence handling, including how DNA from the knife sheath was collected and tested. They requested detailed chain of custody records and cross-examination opportunities for the forensic lab personnel. The court allowed these challenges to be examined at trial, but the evidence itself was not suppressed. Although the defense did not publicly present any verified alternate suspect, they emphasized reasonable doubt in pretrial filings. They sought to argue that circumstantial evidence alone, particularly in high-profile cases with intense media coverage, could be interpreted in multiple ways. In court, they stressed that forensic methods, while powerful, are not infallible and should be scrutinized rigorously by jurors. Legal experts observed that this approach is typical in cases where DNA evidence is strong. By attacking methodology, questioning procedural handling, and emphasizing constitutional rights, the defense hoped to challenge the narrative without denying the gravity of the crimes. For the victims' families, these defense motions often caused frustration and emotional strain. Every legal challenge extended pretrial proceedings, delaying closure and prolonging the public discussion of the murders. Yet, from a legal perspective, these motions were necessary to ensure that Kohberger received due process. In the broader context, the defense strategy highlights ongoing debates in U.S. courts over new forensic technologies, privacy concerns, and digital evidence. The Idaho case serves as a benchmark, showing how constitutional arguments interact with modern investigative methods. As the trial approached later in 2025, these strategies set the stage for tense courtroom confrontations, with the prosecution and defense locked in a battle over evidence reliability, interpretation, and admissibility, a struggle that would define how the jury ultimately understood the case. After years of investigation, pretrial hearings, and legal battles, Bryan Kohberger faced his sentencing in July 2025. On July 23, 2025, the Idaho court delivered a verdict that marked the conclusion of the judicial process for the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for burglary and other related charges. The sentence was part of a plea deal that spared him from the death penalty. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the deliberate targeting of the victims, and the sheer brutality involved. For the families, the day brought a mix of relief, grief, and unresolved emotions. Some expressed that the life sentence allowed them a sense of closure without prolonging legal battles through a death penalty trial. Others felt that justice had been partially compromised, wishing for the ultimate punishment to match the severity of the crime. Some news outlets reported that families were visibly divided in their responses to the plea deal and sentencing. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the weight of the tragedy. Survivors, extended family members, and the local community were present as the judge detailed the evidence, acknowledged the pain of the victims' families, and formally imposed the life sentences. Statements by victims' families highlighted the emotional toll of waiting for justice, the heartbreak of losing loved ones, and the long journey to reach the sentencing stage. Beyond the courtroom, the Kohberger sentencing has sparked discussions nationally about how the U.S. legal system handles plea deals in high-profile murder cases. Some argue that avoiding the death penalty ensures swifter closure for families and prevents the emotional strain of a lengthy trial. Others debate whether life imprisonment without parole sufficiently conveys the severity of such heinous crimes. The July 2025 sentencing also reinforced the role of forensic evidence and investigative diligence. DNA evidence, cell phone records, and investigative genealogy had been upheld in court, and the sentence reflected the accumulation of this verified evidence. Analysts and legal experts note that without these confirmations, the plea deal and life sentences might not have been possible. For the public, the sentencing marked a definitive moment in one of the most closely followed true crime cases of the decade. The story of Bryan Kohberger, once unfolding as a series of legal challenges and unanswered questions, had reached a conclusion, at least in terms of judicial outcome. Yet the social, emotional, and legal reverberations of this case continue to be felt, highlighting the profound impact of violent crime on both families and communities. The Bryan Kohberger case, while rooted in Moscow, Idaho, has had ripples far beyond the local community. One of the most significant national implications lies in the use of investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, in criminal investigations. Prior to Kohberger's arrest and trial, IGG had been applied in only a handful of high-profile cases across the United States. Its use here, confirmed and upheld in court rulings throughout 2025, reinforces the precedent that such methods are admissible when conducted lawfully with proper warrants. Legal experts note that this ruling may influence future cases, particularly those involving violent crimes where conventional leads are scarce. Courts now have a clearer benchmark for balancing privacy concerns with the need for investigative tools. The Kohberger case demonstrates that DNA obtained through consumer genealogy databases, when paired with traditional forensic methods, can form a robust evidentiary chain. Additionally, the case highlights the integration of digital evidence into criminal investigations. Cell phone tower pings, surveillance video, and time-stamped transactions all played a crucial role in corroborating physical evidence. Analysts have pointed out that Kohberger's prosecution shows how multimodal evidence, when meticulously documented and legally obtained, can withstand defense challenges. Beyond courtroom considerations, the case has sparked national discussion about plea deals, sentencing, and family closure. The decision to accept a plea deal and impose life sentences instead of pursuing the death penalty has prompted debates in legal circles, media outlets, and victim advocacy forums. Some argue this approach provides timely resolution and reduces trauma for families. Others believe it may not fully reflect the severity of the crime. From a sociological perspective, Kohberger's case underscores the challenges of violent crime in small communities. Moscow, Idaho was shaken not only by the murders themselves, but also by the prolonged legal proceedings, the media spotlight, and the national attention. The transparency of court filings, public release of surveillance videos, and reporting on DNA evidence have collectively shaped how Americans understand the intersection of criminal justice and technology. Finally, the case serves as a template for future investigative standards. By combining IGG, digital tracking, and traditional forensic science, law enforcement has demonstrated a methodical approach to complex, multi-victim cases. Scholars, lawyers, and criminal justice students continue to study the Kohberger investigation as a benchmark for how modern techniques can effectively solve high-profile crimes. As the Kohberger case fades from immediate headlines, its influence on forensic methodology, legal precedent, and national discourse will endure. The lessons from 2025 will likely inform investigations for years to come, shaping how law enforcement, courts, and families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. The Idaho student murders case may have reached sentencing, but its echoes will last far longer. Bryan Kohberger will spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the families, the grief continues. And for the legal system, the questions raised about DNA, technology, and justice will echo in courtrooms for years to come. This is not the end of the story. Subscribe and stay tuned, because we'll continue to bring you verified updates on every major development in true crime.